The first time Grace saw Elijah, he was standing beside the rose arch with a pair of rusted shears. The morning sun casting a halo of light around his unruly curls. His shirt was worn at the collar, and his boots were stained with old mud, but he had the kind of stillness about him that made the whole garden hold its breath. She had just come out with her teacup, expecting to find the roses still strangled by weeds. Instead, she found him already halfway through the third row, humming a hymn she vaguely recognized from her childhood. Grace was 49, recently widowed, and fading into a loneliness that had crept into the wood of her house. Her late husband, Charles, had died of a stroke the previous spring. The world had grown too quiet since then, except for the whispers. They came from the walls, from the floorboards, from the wind through the ivy, but most of all from the garden. So when she found a flyer tucked inside her mailbox reading, "Professional gardener available, discreet, skilled, affordable," she took it as a sign. No one remembered seeing the flyer delivered. Maria, her housekeeper, said it hadn't been there in the morning mail. Grace didn't ask questions. She simply dialed the number. A low voice answered, said he could come the next morning. And so he did. Elijah. He never spoke much. His replies were polite but brief. Yet Grace found herself talking more and more. She told him about the winter storm that had ruined the trellis, about Charles's obsession with order, about her dreams of turning the garden into a sanctuary. Elijah listened, always working, always quiet. Every day he arrived just as the sun touched the eastern fence. Always the same faded jacket, always the same rhythm in his steps. Grace began to time her mornings to him: coffee at 7. A walk by 8, a chat near the fountain by 9. She would tell him how her husband never liked roses. Elijah would nod and trim one with care, as if the rose itself deserved an apology. Maria never saw him, not once. At first she brushed it off as coincidence. Elijah came early, she came late, but soon she began to worry. "Miss Grace," Maria said one cloudy afternoon, drying her hands on a dish towel, "I've never seen this man. You talk about him like he's always around." "Are you sure?" Grace interrupted with a soft laugh. "Oh, he's always around. You just don't see him when you're rushing. He's quiet, gentle. You have to look with your heart." Maria. That night, Maria turned on the security cameras. Grace had never used them since Charles passed. The system came back online with a flicker. For 3 days, they recorded. Elijah came and went, just like always. Grace walked with him, laughed with him, handed him lemonade. When Maria reviewed the footage, there was no one there. Just Grace, talking to empty air, laughing at jokes no one had told, pausing mid-conversation with a ghost. "Miss Grace," Maria said again, more gently this time, "there's something wrong." But Grace only smiled. She had stopped brushing her hair. Her meals sat untouched. She no longer read the news. Her entire life was stitched into the soil and petals of the garden, and into Elijah. She called him, "my love," one morning. Then, "my second life," the next. When Maria objected, Grace turned, eyes glassy. "Don't you see? He's the only one who's still real." That night, Grace wrote in her journal, "I think I'm falling in love again. It's strange, and quiet, and a little mad, but isn't all love a little mad?" Outside, the roses trembled in the breeze, and somewhere in the rustle of leaves, Grace could almost hear Elijah humming that old hymn once more. Elijah had stories Grace could almost touch. One late morning, as mist hovered low above the flowerbeds, he told her about his childhood in Tuscany. He spoke with tenderness of a small farmhouse nestled between rows of lavender, of his mother who hummed lullabies while pruning roses, of the way the fog there smelled like thyme and wood smoke. Grace closed her eyes and imagined the scene, not with effort, but with aching familiarity, as though she had been there herself. Just a lifetime ago, they drank tea under the trellis, the fading petals of climbing roses dropping onto their porcelain cups. Elijah described the language of flowers. "Daisies are for innocence," he said softly, "peonies for shame, and roses, they're never about love, They're about memory. Some things bloom so we remember they once existed. Grace's laugh, thin but bright, rang out through the garden. She hadn't laughed like that in years. Not since Harold died. Not since silence took up residence in the halls of the estate. With Elijah, she felt her age retreat. Her skin pulled taut not with youth, but with a pulse of relevance, of feeling seen again. That night, it rained, not a soft drizzle but a full storm, one that rattled windows and shook old tree limbs loose. Grace couldn't sleep. She wrapped herself in a wool shawl and stepped out barefoot into the drenched garden. Heart pounding, and there he was, Elijah, standing still beneath the arbor, soaked but serene. He reached for her hand, and they stood in the rain. It was absurd. It was beautiful. She leaned into him, and in her memory, or was it her dream? He kissed her forehead like someone who knew all her sadness. The next morning, Maria found Grace passed out on the garden bench, shivering. Her nightgown clung to her like wet paper, and her breath came in shallow gasps. The doctor arrived by noon. Grace had a high fever. As she drifted in and out of lucidity, she kept whispering, "He kissed me, he kissed me." Maria grew alarmed, not just by the fever, but by the isolation Grace imposed on herself. The teacups only ever had one lipstick mark. The plates were always cleaned by Grace alone. No one else had seen Elijah. Not the delivery man, not the mailwoman, not the cleaner. Maria began to wonder, was Elijah ever real? When Maria suggested a psychiatrist, Grace responded with fire. "I am in love." "Maria, not delusional. Why do you want to take that away from me?" Then came the wedding dress. Grace called a boutique in town and arranged for a white gown. Simple and elegant, she told them she would marry in the garden on the last Sunday of the month. Maria waited until Grace left for her afternoon walk and accessed the security recordings. She combed through every day, every hour, Grace speaking aloud to no one. Grace pouring 2 cups of tea and drinking both. Grace dancing in the garden with invisible arms. When confronted, Grace only smiled. Elijah doesn't like being filmed. He's very shy. Sometimes cameras lie. Maria. That night, her diary bore the line, "He is the light I cannot live without." Outside, the roses swayed in the wind. Inside, Grace slept soundly, one arm outstretched across the bed, fingers curled, as if cradling someone who wasn't there. The sun rose gently over the estate on a crisp spring morning, casting warm light through the ivy-laced windows and across the wild garden paths. In the backyard, Grace stood before her mirror, pale and glowing, a white gown flowing down her figure like mist over morning grass. Her fingers, fragile but determined, fastened each button along her spine with precision. The bouquet she had assembled lay on the vanity, white roses, blue forget-me-nots, and a single purple hyacinth. She called it her wedding bouquet. She had arranged it herself, petal by petal. The night before, Grace moved through the garden with the quiet ceremony of a bride walking an aisle only she could see. She spoke softly, joyfully, to someone beside her, though no one walked there. She set a table in the center of the rose path, complete with white linens, 2 glasses, and a bottle of champagne. One glass remained untouched, bubbling with golden light. The other, she sipped from between murmurs of laughter and love. A neighbor walking his dog paused by the fence, watching. Grace sat at the table, eyes full of emotion, speaking to the air across from her. The neighbor frowned and called for Maria, who rushed outside, alarm in her stride. "Mrs. Grace," Maria pleaded, stepping into the garden, "you're out here alone. There's no one here. Please, come inside." But Grace's expression turned thunderous. Her eyes sharpened with fury. She stood and raised her voice, trembling. "Don't insult my husband like that. You're not invited." Maria froze, heart pounding, her hands raised in surrender. She glanced at the untouched glass. She heard the murmurs of the garden wind, but no other voice. No footsteps, no one at all. The neighbor had recorded the exchange. Within hours, the video spread across local networks, then wider, re-shared with mocking titles, "Woman Marries the Wind," and "Bride of the Breeze." People watched, commented, laughed. A psychiatrist was sent from the city. He waited in the sitting room while Maria tried to coax Grace inside. But Grace refused to speak unless Elijah could sit with her. She sat cross-legged on the garden bench, white veil fluttering, clutching her bouquet like a relic. Maria, desperate, searched the estate again. She found no employment forms, no phone logs, no background checks, nothing indicating that an Elijah had ever been hired. She even checked the post, the emails, the old gardener's toolshed. Nothing, only Grace's journal, filled with pages about Elijah, their conversations, his favorite teas, the way he hummed when he dug. That evening, Grace sat before her vanity once again. She brushed her hair with slow strokes, humming to herself. The mirror reflected only her, alone, but she smiled as if someone stood behind her, whispering tenderly into her ear. "Tonight," she said aloud, "you'll stay with me." She laid down in the garden once more, the wedding dress slightly dirtied from the grass and soil. She curled beside the rosebush she had tended with such care, her bouquet nestled at her chest. And all through the night, beneath the moonlight and the restless wind, no one lay beside her. Grace's fever spiked on a pale, overcast Wednesday, the kind of day where the sky itself seems hesitant to commit to light or shadow. The nurses on duty would later recount how her whispers had begun before dawn. Tangled in dream and delirium. "Elijah," she murmured again and again, her voice threadbare and fragile. "Don't leave the garden yet. The roses are blooming." Her hands, once delicate and deliberate in their movements, now clutched at the sheets with a frantic, vine-like urgency, fingers curling and twisting as though reaching for something rooted in a world no one else could see. Maria, exhausted and fraying at the edges of worry, stood at the threshold of Grace's bedroom for a long moment before finally dialing the number she had tucked away like a secret. The psychiatrist arrived later that afternoon, no longer a gentle consultant, but a state-sanctioned decision. A court order was in his coat pocket, crisp and undeniable. Grace, draped in her nightgown like a ghost who hadn't yet accepted she'd died, did not struggle. She merely looked at Maria, eyes clear with something that could have been betrayal or release, and asked softly, "Just don't crush the lavender. It took so long to come back." The psychiatric facility was antiseptic and humming with a false serenity. Grace, now under constant observation, slipped between moments of piercing lucidity and long stretches of fog. She rarely responded to questions about her mental state, but she painted, always the same figure, a man standing quietly in a garden, sometimes cradling a bloom, sometimes cloaked in the rain. One of the nurses, a film enthusiast, noticed the resemblance. The man in the sketches looked eerily like the romantic lead in a forgotten 1980s British drama, a film Grace had adored in the years before Harold died. It had been their comfort on stormy evenings, a small and shared reverie. The same film, Maria would later confirm, had a gardener named Elijah. The doctors met in clean, quiet rooms to diagnose her delusional disorder, compounded by bereavement, prolonged isolation, unresolved grief. The terms were neat, their words cut into her story like scalpels trying to dissect a ghost. They didn't see the longing behind the delusion, the yearning threaded into every imagined syllable, every phantom embrace. Maria visited her a week into her confinement. She looked older, too. Her hands shook as she placed a small pot of lavender on the windowsill of Grace's room. The scent, sharp and earthy, filled the sterile air. Grace, curled beneath a knitted blanket, opened her eyes slowly. "He'll come back, Maria," she whispered, voice nearly gone. "He promised, when the lavender blooms again." The staff began reviewing Grace's journals. Maria had turned them in reluctantly, clutching them like sacred texts. Within, entire worlds unfolded, pages upon pages of conversations between Grace and Elijah. They argued about flowers, shared memories, planned a life that bloomed only on the page. There were no interruptions, no alternate voices, just the cadence of two people, one real, one imagined, building a world from grief and hope. One intern, a young woman with quiet eyes and a heart too soft for this line of work, said that Grace smiled each morning before breakfast. Not a manic grin, not the grin of someone untethered, but the smile of someone expecting a letter, or a kiss, or the sound of footsteps on garden gravel. A smile that made her shift the curtains slightly each time she passed. Every morning, without fail, Grace would ask the same question to whoever entered with medication or breakfast or charts. Her voice was never loud, but it always carried weight. "Did you see him in the garden today? Elijah? He's very shy, but he always comes when the flowers are right." And then she would close her eyes. Not to sleep, but to see what only she could. In that garden behind her eyelids, with its ever-blooming roses and lavender paths, Elijah was still waiting. Years folded over each other like pressed petals, and time softened the lines of Grace's face. At the care facility, where each corridor smelled faintly of antiseptic and chamomile tea, she became something of a quiet legend. Grace, the widow in white. Grace, who spoke to flowers. Grace, who waited. Her hair had turned silver, soft as the feathers of the doves that sometimes perched on the garden fence. But her hands, though marked by age, remained graceful, still attuned to the secret rhythms of root and soil. Every morning, before breakfast, she would shuffle out into the hospital's modest garden with a small trowel tucked beneath her arm and a packet of seeds in her apron pocket. She never asked for help. She simply knelt among the leaves, whispering to the plants like old friends. "This one's for Elijah," she'd say to no one in particular, planting a row of purple pansies. He always said they looked like they were listening. The nurses, those who had stayed long enough to know her rhythms, told new patients and younger staff her story in quiet tones. Part warning, part reverence. She fell in love with a ghost, they'd say, but don't feel sorry for her. She loved better than most ever do. Grace spoke little as the years waned, but when she did, it was with the softness of falling leaves. She no longer asked if Elijah had visited. Instead, she spoke to him as though he never left. When her joints ached, she would murmur, I know, you told me to wear the gloves." Then, one morning, a morning like any other, when the dew clung to spiderwebs and the sky stretched gray over the world, Grace did not come out to the garden. A nurse found her in bed, curled toward the window, the lavender pot still on the sill, now in full bloom. In her hands was a leather-bound notebook, the edges worn smooth with love and memory. It was her journal, her chronicle of invisible devotion. The final page bore only one sentence, written in a hand that trembled but still knew beauty. "Love does not need the world to believe in it, only the heart that carries it." At her funeral, which was attended by few but remembered by many, Maria arrived wearing a plain black dress. Her hair was white now, gathered in a bun. She placed a fresh pot of lavender at the foot of Grace's casket and whispered, "You waited so well." A month later, the hospital administrators approved a proposal. The old courtyard garden, once neglected, now blooming in impossible colors, was renamed in her honor. A small wooden sign was planted beside the roses. "The Garden of Light in memory of one who saw what we could not." And the garden seemed to remember her. Birds returned each spring to sing over the marigolds. Bees lingered long at the lavender. And somewhere beneath the soil, a seed of longing grew into peace. One afternoon, a young nurse, new to the ward, wandered out with a watering can. She was humming to herself when she saw someone, standing across the rows. A tall figure, backlit by sun, unmoving between the hedges. She blinked, looked again. No one was there, but the breeze stirred, and the scent of lavender rose in waves. The petals danced, as if stirred by a hand not seen. The nurse smiled despite herself. And from somewhere far, or maybe very close, came the faintest echo. "The garden remembers. It always had."